All right, it looks like we're live. So, Paul, thanks for coming on and being willing to have a conversation with me. I really appreciate it. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
I'm Paul Moser, and I teach at Loyola University in Chicago. And Tom contacted me, I suspect, because I have written some articles and books on the knowledge of God. Tom seems to be intrigued by that topic, so he got in touch and asked if we could have a discussion.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So, you've written a lot on religious epistemology specifically, and your take is a lot different than many common apologists like William Lane Craig and Alvin Plantinga and Richard Swinburne. They take an evidential approach where they take the classical philosophical arguments and use those as evidence to indicate the existence of God, whereas your approach seems to be more about personal experience, personal revelation, those kinds of things. Is that an accurate description?
Yes, that's right, Tom. But I think we should back up a little. For me, the big question at the start and at every point is just this: which God? Because the idea of God is so broad and ambiguous and even vague in many ways that I think questions about God are usually pointless until we back up and clarify what we have in mind. So when I ask about God's existence, I have in mind a very particular kind of possible being, one who is worthy of worship. So I take the little word God to be a title, a perfectionist title that requires worthiness of worship. Now, that's a loaded notion, worthiness of worship, but it's appropriate because in traditional monotheism, God is understood as one worthy of worship. Well, what does that require? It requires at least moral perfection. That is, there can be no moral defect. What else does it require? It requires full moral goodness, no room for falling short on moral goodness. Well, if that's in place, then something else has to be in place. God must be redemptive toward humans. In other words, God must seek what is best, all things considered, for them. Now, notice we've left the terrain of deism and abstract philosophy. We're no longer talking about Aristotle's God of thought thinking itself. We're no longer talking just about Plato's God, whatever's going on in the Timaeus. We're talking about a being who, if that being exists, is morally robust and morally challenging. So I want to put our discussion in that context because as it happens, that context colors everything in our religious epistemology.
Well, can you talk a little bit about where that came from? The idea of a being worthy of worship, because that kind of seems arbitrary to me, just to kind of pick something. And like the idea of worthy of worship seems kind of subjective, where you could just pick what you define as being worthy of worship, and that's kind of
Mhm.
arbitrary.
Well, let's face it, we all choose our definitions. All inquirers have to settle on definitions. If we didn't, we couldn't have any inquiry. So we end up being responsible for the definitions we pick. And typically we do pick definitions relative to our theoretical goals, our goals in inquiry. So Everybody's making choices there. The only question is, which choice will you make and why? Now, I happen to be interested in what traditional monotheism has been interested in. Is there a being who excels as a moral agent to such an extent that that being merits our careful attention and even obedience? Now, the answer in the end may be no, but we at least need to entertain that question. We can lower the bar later and talk about the God of deism if we fail on the God of monotheism. But we can't simply ignore that conceptual option. That would be cheating. And we should never cheat when we're doing philosophy. So I'm picking a notion of God that should be of interest to all of us, excuse me, and has been central in the history of monotheism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and so on. In all of those major traditions, God is offered as worthy of worship. Now, you may have questions about a different kind of God, and that's fine. I'm willing to talk about that different kind of God. But I will say, in that case, we have lowered the bar, and I will ask from you why you want to lower the bar.
Well, I'm curious, like, why you would say that would be lowering the bar. For example, if we talked about Zeus or Thor or the Norse gods,
Yeah,
they may consider those gods to be worthy of worship as opposed to the Christian God. And I'm sure that many of, because I have some friends who are polytheists and do believe in those
yes,
kinds of gods, and they look at the Christian God and they laugh and say, well, he can't do what Thor can do, or he can't do what Zeus can do, or he doesn't have those kinds of qualities. And so they seem to look at the Christian God and say he's not worthy of worship. And they look at
yes.
the Norse gods and say, well, they are worthy of worship. And so from their perspective, it seems like you're the one lowering the bar and they are not.
Okay, notice how you put that. You put it in terms of what Zeus or Thor can do. You put it in a power manner where the issue was Zeus and Thor are more powerful than the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, I've made a claim not about relative power, but about relative moral goodness. Now, nobody is going to claim that Thor is morally perfect. Thor is a moral bully, and Zeus is anything but morally perfect. So, nobody's going to fight on that ground. If you want to make the case based on power, then you seem to be working with the notion of God as the biggest bully on the block. Now, is that the notion you want to talk about? Because notice, I'm going to come back on all of your questions to which God are you talking about when you're asking for reasons? If you're talking about Zeus and Thor or some other bully, a Donald Trump like God who works by intimidation and by mocking and belittling, then we're going to have one discussion. If, however, we're not just talking about raw power, but moral perfection, we're going to have a different kind of discussion. But my point is this: you can't do justice to the question until you're clear on what kind of God you're asking about. And I myself have really no interest in Zeus or Thor because they don't attract my moral attention at all. And I'm not interested in sheer bullies who have a lot of power and, in effect, reflect the behavior of the current president of the United States. I
Um,
actually have no interest in beings of that sort with regard to their being good examples for anything, because I don't think they are good examples.
well, I'm
On the other
curious.
hand, if you're talking about God, you at least want to be talking about someone who's commendable, not just a powerful bully, not just the biggest bully on the playground, but is actually commendable as a good agent.
Well, could you talk about why that is? So why did you pick moral or the being worthy of worship as the trait that you find the most important when talking about God?
Well, it's crucial because if you look at what we as humans need more than anything, it is in fact moral challenge and improvement. Our social problems are inherently moral and are in need of moral guidance for our own good. So that's a simple motivational reason. You could call that existential if you wish. But at the same time, if you look at the history of monotheism and its inquiry about God, the focus is on moral goodness. In other words, how can we be holy as God is holy? That's in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Thor and Zeus don't care about that. And that's why I think they have fallen off among humans in interest, because when you look at them carefully, they really don't have much to offer by way of what we really need. Again, I'm willing to talk about these, what I'll call lesser gods, but they really don't offer what we need as morally responsible inquirers. And we are morally responsible. We aren't simply minds asking questions. We are beings who are morally accountable for how we use our time. And I don't want to turn religious epistemology into something as trivial as checkers, where we're just playing intellectual games and one person is trying to be smarter than the other. There are vital moral needs that we have as individuals and as a society. And if our concept of God doesn't speak to those somehow, it quickly becomes irrelevant. And that's what you see in a lot of historical concepts of God. Their relevance falls off and they disappear into the dustbin of history. Zor and Thus, Zeus and Thor are gods of that sort. I got their names wrong. I'm sorry. So I don't think about them enough even to get their names right. But you did mention um, Zeus and Thor, and so I thought I might just use those two as examples of gods who have fallen off in the dustbin of history.
So if Christianity falls off, or Christianity, Islam, and Judaism also fall off into the dustbin of history, would you say that would be because that the idea of morality may not be as fundamental as you once thought? Like, isn't it possible that they do in fact fall off, and in some cultures we see them falling off?
I think it's only a abstract conceptual possibility. As long as we keep them straight in terms of their moral value, and as long as we acknowledge that we are morally responsible agents, they won't fall off. As you remove from the concept of God the moral significance, as some 80% of white evangelicals in the US do when they support Trump, you risk you risk marginalizing the concept of God. And that's what we see going on now in white evangelicalism in the US. It's a view that says, I want the political clout, but I don't need to attend to the moral significance of a person's character. And so God then becomes just a powerful bully who wants to get his way. That's what we see now in American Republican politics at the rate of some 95%, and in white evangelicals in the US at the rate of about 80+%. So that's a move toward demoralizing God. And there is a real risk of the demise of a religion on that front.
Well, I was speaking more specifically about the non-religious countries who, like Finland and Denmark and Sweden and Germany and the UK, who are now majority non-religious or non-affiliated, who are turning away from God. And it seems like the idea of the moral standard that is the Christian and the Abrahamic God seems to be falling off in those cultures.
It falls off in a lot of cultures as those cultures lose sight of the moral challenge of this God and its significance. Typically, what happens is you have a replacement of these moral concerns with something like social efficiency, a kind of can't we all get along, whatever that takes, instead of something morally robust, such as the common good. And we especially see that in the US now, where the Republican Party seems to have no interest in the common good, but seeks rather the interests of the party. And that's why you get brown children in cages at the Mexican border now, US cages, refugees treated as if they don't merit our moral respect. That's a huge illustration of failing to look at the common good. When a society does that, a morally robust conception of God is usually quick behind to be disregarded. And that's what we now see in much of US politics and in other countries too, where a real interest in the common good is being lost sight of. It's much easier to go with the kind of nationalism and an us versus them that excludes refugees and immigrants and circles the wagons around the powers that be. That is not morality, that is clan mentality, and it doesn't reflect the image of a God worthy of worship. So as you move toward these more clan-like, gang-like goals, a robust conception of God as morally good will fall off. It doesn't fit with that clan mindset. And you see that now in the Republican Party in the US, supported by the White House, where you get themes like we don't need to worry about love of enemies, we don't need to worry about forgiveness, we can let that stuff go.
Well, from my perspective, the people who are the most accepting of immigrants, like in Germany, who's accepted several million, seem to be majority non-religious countries. The people who seem to want to be open to all those different cultures seem to be the non-religious kind. And so it seems like you can still have that desire or yearning for the best for everyone in an objective morality, kind of an objective moral framework as a non-religious person. It doesn't seem like God is necessary for that, which is why it's the idea of a God seems to be falling off in the non-religious cultures. They seem to have found a way to get that without a God.
Well, notice Germany started out wide open to refugees and immigrants, including from Syria, but the music has changed there. The open doors are no longer as open, and political careers have been lost over the earlier openness. So it's hardly a uniform message there that's being sent. It's very much a mixed message coming out of Germany. But I do want to make a very simple point here that a person need not be an avowed theist to be open to moral goodness. There is in philosophy a distinction between de re and de dicto. It's an old Latin distinction, which separates relating to a reality from relating to a certain conceptual description of a reality. One can be open to the reality of God without conceptualizing that reality as God. And so an atheist can be far more morally sensitive than a theist. And we see that in the US now, especially if you look at many of the white evangelicals who support Trump's view on refugees. Many atheists are much more morally sensitive than these white evangelicals who want to put brown children at the Mexican border in US cages where some of them have died. This is morally serious stuff. And when you use the name of God to approve of that, you have created a false God. Now, an atheist can be open to divine goodness without acknowledging it as God or God's goodness. That's a de re awareness that isn't de dicto. God would care mainly about the de re and not so much about the de dicto, because the de dicto side is easy to supply. God bringing a person to apply that description is not a difficulty. The difficulty is in getting a person receptive to genuine goodness in a way that person cares about others, even these brown children in cages on the border.
Well, there's two things there I wanted to pick up on. Well, one was that in your original point, you said that the reason you believe that Zeus and Thor died off was because they didn't speak to the moral needs of humanity. And my argument again, my contention to that is that the idea of a Christian Abrahamic God that does speak to our moral needs is also dying off in many cultures, and the cultures that seem to be the most moral are the ones who are trying to attain the closest to morality. And the second thing you said was that um, God would care more about the de re than the de dicto. So does that mean that, from your perspective, an atheist who is moral and seeks that moral groundwork would essentially be able to go to heaven even if they didn't believe in the God's existence?
Yes, no doubt about it. No doubt about it. By the way, your first point was an empirical one. You made a sweeping claim about the Christian God is falling off in, I think you used something like many or most cultures. And that's an empirical issue. Certainly in various European countries, there has been a decline in traditional Christianity. But if you look more widely at some of the more developing countries, you see exactly the opposite. You see exactly growth in Christian theism. And so I would hesitate on your sweeping claim about the Christian notion dropping off. Frankly, I don't think the empirical evidence supports that. Um, but my point is instead that where you have an attention to um, a God of moral robustness, that God brings moral benefits to humans that hold some people to hold on to that concept with all their life. In other words, it becomes part of what makes them who they are. It's not just an intellectual belief like solving a crossword puzzle. It becomes part of their identity that this God is responsible for who I am as a moral agent. Now, um, the important point in this consideration is the de re element, not the de dicto element. And as you may recall, Jesus told a story in Matthew 25 about just this, where at the end time, the judge, he's the judge as the Son of Man and the King, and certain people come, and he says to them, "Well, uh, you you responded to me in a certain way, and because of that, you're blessed by my Father." And they say, "Well, when did we do this? What do you mean we responded positively to you? When did this happen?" And he suggests that when they do it to other people, by implication, they're doing it to him, and he praises them and gives them his Father's approval. That is Jesus saying that the de re component is the key, and the de dicto component can be missing. They said, "When did we do this?" They didn't know. They didn't even know who he was. So it's not about getting the crossword puzzle right. It's about being the kind of human being who is um, agreeable to God's moral character. And that can happen even when a person doesn't know that it's God's moral character to which one is agreeable.
Do you think we can get the crossword puzzle right? Do you think there are logical or evidential reasons that can help us to solve those problems, or do you think it is beyond us entirely?
As you may know, I'm an evidentialist to the core, but I claim the evidence must be the right kind. It can't be the kind that so many apologists latch onto as if it's effective. It can't be the abstract kind involving a first cause, or a vague designer or anything of that traditional sort will fall short of God's character. So the evidence must be fitting to God's character. If it isn't, it's not evidence for God. It's evidence for something else. And the evidence for a first cause, for example, would be evidence for a being who is morally neutral or morally inadequate to meet the standard of a God worthy of worship. And quite aside from the fact that you can't get from a first cause to a personal agent, you can't get from a first cause to a morally perfect agent. You're going to need some other line of evidence. Same for a designer. If you look at the evidence of design in the universe, you might as well postulate Satan as the cause because the evidence is mixed. Some good, some bad. It's a very mixed story. I trust we don't want to think of God as mixed in that way. If we do, then God's just like us. God's like one of the Roman gods. They fight, they're jealous, they're mean to each other. Those gods are just like us. They're reflections of us. Do we need more of that with just more power? I mean, that's what you get in a bully. So the important point is to think of God as having a certain character, and therefore the evidence for God being indicative of that character. If it isn't, it's not going to be evidence for God, even if it's evidence for a powerful bully. So, what kind of evidence should we expect? And here we need to look at what being worthy of worship truly involves. And there are certain people in the history of human thinking who have shed a lot of light on this, who have offered insights. I think Jesus is the best example. I think he's offering us an epistemology. It's reflected in the Apostle Paul. It's very detailed. And the amazing thing is, Christian apologists rarely, if ever, go there. They kind of jump in midstream with Aquinas or some other variation on maybe Anselm a little earlier. They jump in with much later abstract thinking and typically miss the whole point. They give you a bundle of bad arguments that are supposed to convince people, but upon examination only leave you puzzled and confused. And that's pretty much the history of Western Christian apologetics, especially as you find it in the US. A lot of abstract arguments are supposed to be impressive, but preaching only to the choir. You don't find anybody really moved by it who can examine an argument for what it's worth and assess it as being inadequate. And none of those traditional arguments gives you a God worthy of worship. They all give you something much lesser, if they give you a personal God at all. So I'm urging us to look at the right kind of evidence. And as it turns out, the evidence in question is much more challenging than just here. Look at this argument. Is it sound? Is it valid? Are the premises true? That's important work, assessing arguments, but it doesn't take us to the heart of the matter when we're asking about God.
So what does? What is the heart of the matter? What is the evidence for
The
a
heart of the
morally?
matter, as I'm trying to suggest, is God's moral character and what that character involves for us. And one big question that's going to come to us is just this: who am I, as an inquirer about God, asking for evidence for God's existence? A couple of questions are going to come up. What do I expect this evidence to be? And what am I going to do with it if I get such evidence? Am I going to puff myself up with it and pretend that I'm smarter than thou? Look, here's my nice argument. Now I'm going to club you over the head with it. Get in line, or you're not rational. You're irrational if you don't agree with this polished up argument of mine. Is that what I'm going to do with the evidence? If so, God may not give it to me. Because notice, that is not in keeping with the character of God. And so much of the smarter than thou apologetics you get is completely foreign to a conception of God as worthy of worship. It leaves you with a lot of puffed up apologists, but very little what I'll call lived challenge to people open to a challenge. So the evidence is going to be the kind of thing that brings us face to face with the character of God and then says, your move. In other words, checkmate. What are you going to do now? And if I respond by saying, well, I'm just going to put this in my bag of parlor games so I can reflect on it in my casual time and then do whatever I want, that's called trivializing the evidence. That's called taking something that is utterly sacred and valuable and treating it as just common material. In that case, I'm not ready to receive that evidence. I'm not ready to handle it aright. And now here's the key theme that must be introduced in any discussion of religious epistemology. In that kind of case, a God worthy of the title will hide from us, will hide evidence until we are ready and until we no longer trivialize it. We treat little children this way. When we have something very valuable, but they aren't ready to hear it, we don't force it on them. We rather wait until they're prepared to take it in aright. That's called divine hiding, and it's a theme that's rampant throughout Jewish scriptural writings and the New Testament, the Christian New Testament. Divine hiding. In other words, we shouldn't expect God to be trivially obvious.
Okay, so what is, you keep mentioning that there is this evidence that does indicate this morally perfect being worthy of worship. What is it that actually indicates there is this thing and it's not just a asserted property like yellowness or something?
Yeah. The entree is where you would expect it to be. In the deepest center of human moral agency, we call that moral conscience. Moral conscience. When my conscience convicts me to move away from selfishness and toward caring for others unselfishly, something truly amazing has happened. And it's not a simple physical matter. This is a significant, substantial fact of most human beings that their moral conscience challenges them when they do something wrong or when they are morally complacent when they shouldn't be. So, to make a long answer very short, the place where God self manifests and gives evidence of divine reality is in human moral conscience. Yes, we can twist our conscience. Yes, we can suppress it. But that's true of all of our cognitive faculties. We can do that to our vision, our sense of touch, hearing. Yes, we can twist them, we can misuse them, but that doesn't mean there's nothing there as an indicator of reality. Likewise, for moral conscience. And the interesting thing about conscience, if you look at it, is that it is not completely socially determined. Yes, there are sometimes social influences, but conscience works in a way, in many cases, where there is no prior social influence. An individual can find himself or herself challenged to love an enemy, and indeed all enemies, without parental influence or influence from other teachers. So Freud was just wrong on this, that conscience well, as he was on many issues. Um, but Freud was just wrong in suggesting that conscience is simply a function of the influence of your teachers, parents. The empirical data don't bear that out, but Freud was wrong on many empirical issues. That's just one of them.
So why do we think that this moral conscience that we have is fundamental to reality? Why is this indicative of the God that is the foundation of all existence? Why couldn't it just be another thing? Like maybe matter is the foundation of all reality, or maybe
Yeah,
hunger is, or maybe some of the other things we
yeah,
experience.
yeah. I'm not sure what you mean by foundation of all reality. Maybe you mean creator. What I mean by God working in conscience is something very concrete. It's this, that uh, to be a personal agent is to be an intentional agent. What is it for me to be a person? It's to have intentions. That is, to set goals, to be goal oriented. If I didn't have those, I wouldn't be a person. And by the way, that category goes beyond humans. My cats can have that, dogs can have that. So persons can be outside the human species. But the point I'm making is that to be a person, you have to have intentional agency. Now, the big question for evidence for God is going to be, is your alleged uh, evidence indicative of intentional agency? The remarkable thing about human conscience is that it can lead a person if you're responsive to it. In other words, my conscience can lead me away from selfishness toward care for others, unselfish concern for others, and can deepen that care and concern for others in a way that is intentional or purposive. In other words, leading toward a goal or purpose. If that's not present, you don't have evidence of a personal agent. And so you can have all the um, complexity in the world you want, but until you get some kind of uh, purpose of leading, you don't have an evidence for God. So it's that intentional feature that's crucial. But you mentioned foundation of reality, and there I take it you meant something more like, well, I think God is the origin, the causal origin based on conscience. Is that
Sort of. So it's like when we see morality, I agree we definitely have this moral conscience, but why do we think that this moral conscience gives us some kind of knowledge or indication towards whatever is the absolute core of reality, the creator, the foundation, whatever kind of term you want to use? Why isn't this just another thing in reality? Why is it the most important thing? Because my table does not have morality in it. My guitar does not have morality in it. They're just made of matter. So why don't we? Why isn't matter? Why doesn't matter supersede morality? Why is morality the most important of these things?
well, I take it, would you agree with me that you are more important than your guitar or your table? I take it you would agree with me on that. In
Yes,
fact,
from
if
I'm
I
sure.
behaved toward you as if that weren't true, I'd probably end up in jail. I don't think it's an accident that I would end up in jail if I behaved toward you in a way that suggested your guitar or your table were more important than you. I don't think that's an accident. Do you agree with me? So if I were
Well,
dragged into court and said, "Oh well, you know, I just had Tom bumped off, but so what? He's not as important as his guitar or his table. I wanted his guitar or table, and they're just as important as Tom." Do you think that would go anywhere in a court of law?
not if you're president,
No. Do you think it should go anywhere in a court of law?
of course.
Okay. So we agree that you are more important than your table or your guitar.
Right, but that doesn't mean. Does that
Now,
mean that that's true universally, or is it just something we choose to a value we place on reality?
well, let me take it a step further. Suppose you and I wander into a culture where they're torturing infants, and we say to them, "Hold it, stop. You people are so messed up here. You are doing what's utterly evil, and we're going to do everything we can to stop you." Now, I want to suggest that when you and I say to them, "You shouldn't torture infants," we are in touch with something that is morally correct. This is a moral fact that people shouldn't torture infants. I don't think it's a nice view to have in our culture, maybe over the hill. Uh, People are doing other things. They're torturing infants, and it's okay with them over there. It's okay for them over there. I want to suggest that that's a gross misunderstanding of morality. Morality doesn't change by which side of the hill you're on and whether you think it's okay to torture infants. That doesn't change whether it's okay. Torturing infants is morally evil. Why? Because it's a moral fact that moral goodness excludes that. There is such a thing as moral goodness, and it excludes torturing infants. If a person doesn't agree on that, then I want to suggest that person has missed out on what morality is. That person is talking about something else, social convention, or what seems to be uh, popular in a certain group. But that's very different from what traditionally we mean by moral goodness. Here's the point. Matter itself, what you call the material world, just by itself doesn't have intentions. Your table doesn't have intentions. Your chair doesn't have intention. It's not a moral agent, and therefore it's not a candidate for moral respect or any kind of moral response. It's not in the right category. So what happens with moral conscience, if we're being led there toward moral goodness, it's a different kind of thing from the material world. It's part of what we call the personal world, the world of agency or agents. God would be in that realm and not in the realm of matter that has no intentions.
Why is that? So, because if I look at the world and I can create a list of all the things that I experience in the world, and we have the moral conscious, which I'm a moral realist, so I believe there are true moral facts, and we have the material things, the physical things, and we have personal experience and imagination and stories, and we can just list all the different things we have. Why are we picking morality and saying this one is the most important? Like, we definitely see it as the most important, but it does only seem to apply to a small subset of the things in reality, namely persons and intentions. Whereas if we pick something else like space and time, those seem to apply to everything in reality, including our personality and our intentions, but also the matter and the other things. So it seems like, wouldn't that be a better candidate for saying this is the fundamental thing as opposed to the morality? Why are we picking the morality as the most fundamental thing?
Well, again, I'm a little unclear on what you mean by the fundamental thing. I'm suggesting that there is such a thing as moral goodness. And I'm suggesting there's the fact of the matter about moral goodness. And I'm suggesting the following. There are all other kinds of goodness in the world that we could list. There's physical goodness, there's prudential goodness, there's aesthetic goodness. There's all these different kinds of goodness. And the physical world has a lot of good about it. I mean, its stability is a good thing. It's good for many people and what they want to accomplish. And so we enjoy that in the physical world. But what I'm suggesting is this, that when you look at the different kinds of goodness, some of them can be ranked above others on the ground that they would be good even if the others didn't exist at all. So even if there were no physical features of the world, and I don't think this is too hard to imagine, there would still be goodness in moral agents who exist. I don't think moral agents require physical bodies logically. I think Plato was right on that.
I can agree with that. I don't see any problem with the possibility of beings existing without physical bodies. But my
Good.
question
Now,
is more fundamental than
Mhm.
that. It's when I see morality, I agree there is morality. I agree there is true moral facts. But there's also other facts that are true that are not moral. So there's different kinds of facts. You have the moral facts and you have the non-moral facts. So why are we picking moral facts? Because when we talk about God, we're not just talking about a thing. Like, we could say maybe there is a moral truth out there that's just a moral particle or an undiscovered law or just a being who was created by something else, like just one of the Greek gods or something, just a lesser moral being. And
Yeah,
it has that worthy of worship property, but it's not the
yeah,
most fundamental thing. It's not what, it wouldn't really
yeah.
fit what we call God in that sense. Because I don't think you, or would you refer to a God that was morally perfect, but was created by a different thing in some sense?
Well, the way to look at it is this, and this elicits what we value about reality. This question: um, consider two worlds. One of them is a world of moral agents, but there are no physical things in that world. I think we can easily imagine that. You might imagine that as a world of God before creation. Okay. You may think that's a myth and it's not actuality, but you can imagine it. It's coherent. People could write a novel about it. And now imagine another scenario. The universe consists just of physical stuff, but there are no moral agents. It's just bleakly and blindly physical. A lot of bodies in motion, but no moral agents. So here's my question: which world is more valuable, all things considered?
Sure, the one with the people in it, but the
Good, the one with the
value.
moral agents. Now, what that does is elicit what we regard as more valuable, namely moral agency over pure physical actuality. I'm glad you agree on that because I could imagine some person balking. But what it shows is that in our understanding of relative value, moral agency is superior to physical vastness.
What do you mean by that? Because from my perspective, because I can imagine a universe with just physical stuff and no morality, it seems like the morality isn't an intrinsic part of the universe. It's just kind of like an add-on. It's an
It's
addition to
not
it.
an intrinsic part of the physical universe. So you can't make any inference beyond that because you and I haven't established that only the physical universe is the universe. You need that additional assumption, but you and I haven't established that. And I don't think we're going to because I think reality includes the physical universe, but I don't think the physical universe exhausts reality. Now, you may be a materialist of some sort, but that's a controversial view among those of us who think God's reality is evidentially grounded, is, in other words, rational to endorse.
Well, if I just grant that, and let's assume there is a supernatural realm or non-physical realm, and morality exists within that realm, it's still just one of the things that exists in reality. And so, why is this thing why do we place this thing over the other things? If there can be a universe without morality, there's like two universes. One is a supernatural universe with morality, and one is a physical universe with just matter. Why is it that the moral thing has any precedence over the physical thing and not the other way around? Why is it that maybe these two things are equal or have equal status in the universe, and so it wouldn't be correct to call the thing worthy of worship moral any or the thing worthy of worship God any more than the physical thing God, because they both have equal status in the universe or in reality in some sense?
Yeah.
Why are we taking the morality and elevating it above everything else?
One point I like to emphasize is that whenever we use terms like status or fundamental or priority, they call for some kind of qualifier. And so I'd have to ask you what you mean by equal status. Do you mean equal ontic status or epistemological or axiological? So when you say the physical realm has equal status to the divine realm, or at least what you call the moral realm, the supernatural moral realm, when you say they have equal status, when you ask about that, I need to know what kind of status you're talking about because there's so many different kinds we could be talking about. Financial status. Maybe the physical has more financial status than God, right? Maybe God has a vow of poverty and doesn't have a lot of money. unlike many of the religious hucksters around us who seem to be flush with cash. Maybe God's very different from them. So I need to know what sense of status you have. The sense that I have in mind is just this. If you had a being who was worthy of worship and therefore used moral conscience to try to relate to people, to challenge them, to wake them up, to say, get out of your complacency, stop playing your intellectual games, and get serious about what really matters in life. If you had a God who was after that kind of good influence, it strikes me that that kind of being would be eminently more valuable, certainly from a moral standpoint, than a vast physical, impersonal domain. Do we
Okay.
agree on that?
Well, yeah. So, but my question is more like the ontological status of value. So, if I said we can have a morally perfect being, and his name is Bob, and he's just standing behind me, and it's not an all-powerful being. It doesn't create the universe. It's not outside of space and time. It's just a guy named Bob who is morally perfect. It seems like you can have that quality of being morally perfect without having any other special properties. You don't need to be all powerful or all knowing. You don't need to have created the universe. You don't need to have started a
Yes.
religion. Like all of those seem to be extra properties you don't actually
Yeah.
need to be morally perfect. So
You
it's
are you are right, but we need a qualification. And by the way, the point you're making here is a common one in American philosophy of religion around the origin of the process movement. Maybe you've heard of process philosophy in American philosophy. Alfred North Whitehead and various people influenced by him. A number of those people, Edgar Sheffield Brightman, he endorsed a finite God. He held the view that God is finite in power, and he said that's okay. Now, the point I wanted to make was when we talk about God being morally perfect, we aren't talking about dependent moral perfection. In other words, God doesn't owe divine perfection to some other being. So there's a difference between what we'll call intrinsic moral perfection and extrinsic. So suppose that you could control my life in a way that made me morally perfect. So I'm Bob, right? I'm morally perfect, and I owe my moral perfection to you because somehow you've set it up so I'm morally perfect. That would be extrinsic moral perfection. That would not be the kind appropriate to God because you would be the source of it and you would deserve the credit for it. You see? So we need a distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic moral perfection. God is alleged to be intrinsically morally perfect. That is not to depend on another figure for divine moral perfection.
why can't
So the
morality
Bob case
itself
is different.
why can't morality itself just not be or morality itself be a product of something else? So couldn't all morality just be a product of something else, and so there is no such thing as intrinsic morality?
Well, if you take a being who, let's, instead of talking about morality, which is vague, it could be moral principles, it could be moral facts, it could be moral agents. When I'm talking about God, I'm talking about a moral agent. That is a being who performs actions that are morally good. Moral principles don't perform actions. Moral facts don't perform actions. Moral agents do. They perform actions. They have intentions and bring things about on the basis of those intentions. That's why a moral agent is different from your table or your chair. Those don't perform actions, but you do. And so you're morally responsible and could end up in court, but your chair or your table will never end up in court. They aren't agents. They just they don't belong there as being accused of moral wrongdoing of any kind. So in the case of God, you have, if God exists, a moral agent who undertakes actions for the good of others. Now, here's the issue. If there's no being whose moral character is intrinsically good, that is, not dependent on another being, then there is no God worthy of worship. because worthy of worship requires goodness in and of oneself. It can't be a borrowed goodness, or that being wouldn't be worthy of worship. Something else would be. You see that?
Well, yeah, but I don't see the problem there. So, for example, being worthy of worship could be the product of some other thing, and that other thing would, in a sense, be the worthy of worship thing. So, if, for example, if we had a law of nature that was the moral law, essentially, to use a vague term, and that moral law caused the being worthy of worship to be the being, whatever, then we could say, well, we don't actually need the being. We can just say there is this moral law, and this moral law is really what's worthy of worship, regardless of the being. And all it's doing is causing that being to act in such a way that causes it to do moral things,
Yeah,
like to act with intentions towards
yeah.
people. But really, that acting towards intentions isn't what's necessary. All you need is the grounds for that, which doesn't seem to be need to be a intentional being at all. It just needs to be a set of, like, a framework of some kind.
But you've contradicted the notion of a moral agent in that example. Because if a law is causing the being to perform the actions, you don't have genuine agency. You no longer have a moral agent. You have a purely causal story of causal efficiency that doesn't allow for genuine moral agency. See, genuine moral agency requires the ability to do otherwise. If you've got efficient causation in the story, some law requiring this being to behave that way, you don't have the ability to do otherwise. And part of the reason for God's being praiseworthy, as God is supposedly, is that God could have done otherwise, doesn't do otherwise, but could have. So in your example, you've removed the notion of moral agency.
Well, I
You no
adopt more
longer,
of a compatibilism, kind of like Dan Dennett, where I think that the
yeah,
ability to do otherwise is more like a neurological thing. I don't think there is actually a libertarian free will. I don't think it's even logically coherent. I don't think it's possible to have total freedom in that sense. I think that
I didn't
any,
say total freedom. I said the ability to do otherwise. I didn't say the ability to do everything otherwise. Compatibilism doesn't leave you with the notion of agency. Just because the being doesn't feel coerced, or in other words, go against his will, doesn't mean the will is in any way autonomous. So the compatibilist approach is incoherent as an approach to moral agency.
what do you mean? So, from my perspective, you seem to be the free will you, or the, I don't know if free will is the right term, but the
It's fine. Free will's fine.
so the free will you seem to be describing seems to be logically impossible. So if we make any particular choice to choose A or B, and we could have chosen B, well, how could we could have chosen B? Because we to choose A, you either need to choose A for reasons, in which case the choice was either determined by those reasons, or you had to choose A for no reason, in which case it
Yeah.
must have been random.
It's a false dilemma.
How so?
The reasons in question need not be causally determinative. Reasons can be causally influential without being causally determinative. And the key factor is the agency that's employed. The actual acting is what endorses the reasons, which are causally influential without being causally determinative. Now, we know that reasons aren't causally determinative in many cases. For example, take akrasia, the case where Aristotle refuted Plato. Weakness of will is a classic case where I have all the needed reasons, they're in place, my better judgment is formed, but I don't follow those good reasons. I know that I should send a care package today to the abused children at the US Mexican border, courtesy of Trump's evil, but I don't do it. Now, notice I got good reasons, but they don't determine my will because my agency must comply with them for those reasons to be effective. So it's a false dilemma to suggest that in cases of agency, you have to have either determined action or you have something irrational, something that's absurd. That's just a false dilemma.
I'm not following how it's a false dilemma. So if we make a decision to not send aid to the children in the Mexico border, what determined what caused that decision? How did that decision come about?
I choose to follow my best reasons. I choose. That's called agency.
Well, what is
I
the
have
choose? Like,
that
what is
intentional power
how do you choose? What is this choose thing?
carefully. I choose carefully based on the reasons. I deliberate. based on the reasons, but I exercise the power to go this way and send the package rather than not. Or if I don't, then it's a classic case of acrasia. But I make the decision. Now, when you ask how, I can tell you that I looked at my reasons, I deliberated, but at the end of the discussion, I have to say, I decided either this way or that way. That's part of what it is to be an agent. But it doesn't mean it's irrational if it isn't causally determined. That's a false assumption.
Well, that's the part I don't quite understand is because when you say you determined or you chose one way or the other,
Yes.
what does that mean? What is the process by which, like, what is the mechanistic description of that thing, the choosing? Like, because I can describe the choosing in several ways. I can describe the choosing to be a process of like quantum randomness, where it's just a random numerical process that just shoots out a number and then poof, you pick this one decision. Or I can describe it as a determined process where a certain electrical signal goes more one way than the other, which causes it to choose one way or the other. So I can take this idea of choice and I can reduce it and be reductionist essentially into these other things, and it seems coherent. Like this does not, there's no contradiction here. Whereas when you just say it's like a brute fact kind of a thing in and of itself, like there's this just choice essence that exists in the universe, which we've never discovered, it seems to be not as coherent, or it seems to be just essentially an assertion that there's this new kind of thing that we don't have any evidence for.
Well, it's not new at all, and we have plenty of evidence. But notice you beg the question when you ask, what's the mechanistic description of it? That's what you ask. What's the mechanistic description? That just begs the question. Nobody committed to genuine agency would say it's a mechanistic description. It doesn't fit that category for the simple reason that if it is just efficient causation, there's no room for genuine agency. You've taken it out of the picture at the start. That's called begging the question. So this is not a new phenomenon. It's right under our nose, and we exercise it all the time. It's a separate question how deep our analysis of it goes. But what we do know is it doesn't yield to mechanistic explanation in terms of efficient causality, and it doesn't yield to quantum randomness as an explanation, because that is no explanation. So if you want a probabilistic story, maybe that's what you mean by quantum randomness. Maybe you think ultimately it's probabilistic. Yes, there can be probabilities involved, but those don't exhaust the story, because at the end of the day, and Aristotle was right on this against Plato, I can choose even against the probabilities. I can go against what my best evidence indicates. Now, notice how we came down this road. We came to the notion of agency because I suggested that God is a perfect moral agent if God exists. The question that is burning for most people is, what evidence do I have for such an agent? The notion of such an agent is coherent. I can assure you there's no logical problem with it. At least you haven't pointed out a contradiction. And until you do, the burden is yours to show the incoherence. But the notion itself is logically coherent. The interesting question is, what evidence can a person have for satisfying the notion? That is, for a title holder for the title God. Well, I think there's a title holder for the title. That's the big question. And my claim is people have been looking in the wrong place. They've been looking at the stars and the mountains. They've been looking at other kinds of design or first causes. That's to look for evidence in the wrong place. The evidence is rather to be found in human moral experience, where people are morally challenged in a way indicative of God's character. Now, here's the big problem. It's a huge problem for all of us. There's a side of us that doesn't want to face the evidence. Because if I find myself receiving the evidence, guess what? It throws a wrench into how I either have been living my life or would want to live it where I'm in charge. I have to be kind to my enemies. I really don't want to do that. I'd rather get justice or vindication over them somehow instead of having to be caring for them. And, when Trump said at the National Prayer Breakfast last week, I really don't know about this love of enemies stuff. The was it the House chaplain or somebody had just given a prayer that endorsed enemy love, and it might have been the Senate chaplain. I forget who it was, but he said, "No, I can't go along with that." And then he denounced Mitt Romney, and then he denounced Nancy Pelosi. He was saying, in effect, this enemy love stuff, I can't live with that. And he proceeded to show why, and to bully these good people. We all have that in us. That is, the evidence that God brings to us to challenge us doesn't really fit with a lot of our natural tendencies. And so we're very good at kind of keeping it at arm's length, at putting it aside in a way that either obscures it or otherwise deflects it from our attention. What this means is this: the way evidence for God comes to us requires our moral candor and our willingness to comply with it, where our lives could be turned upside down, where I can no longer bully my enemies. I can no longer step on people as I climb a ladder to my own convenience and comfort. I have to start caring about the brown children in cages at the Mexican border. I have to do something about it and not just talk about it or think about it. That's hard for us. We aren't used to that. And so the challenge brought to us regarding evidence for God is morally profound. Philosophers prefer not to go there typically because it's not armchair stuff. It's stuff that makes a difference to a life and to relationships, even with our enemies. That's tough medicine. So all of a sudden, epistemology becomes morally robust in a way that's foreign to the tradition of Western philosophy. I'm claiming we have to face that music if we're going to face the question of evidence for God's reality. If we don't face that music, I claim we're just playing parlor games. We're just showing off, smarter than thou. Look at my neat argument. Isn't that cool? Look, I gotcha. Gotcha here. You missed this. That's a parlor game. I don't think God plays parlor games, at least not with us. And so I don't think we should either with religious epistemology.
Oh yeah, I totally agree with all of that. I would just say that my grounds for morality, and I totally agree, we do need to do something to help all of our fellow human beings and not step on them when climbing a ladder. But I can get that grounds totally without a being worthy of worship. I need no being at all. I can just, even just the idea that there is such a standard is sufficient. You don't actually need it to exist for there to be a morally perfect ideal out there. So from my perspective as a naturalist, atheist, materialist, I believe in moral realism, and I believe there are true moral facts, and I can get all of that without the idea of a God at all. I don't need anything related to a God.
That's true. You can indeed. There's no question about it. Many profound moral realists are atheists. We have whole schools of contemporary philosophy that support moral realism from an atheist standpoint, and they're logically coherent. There's no question about it. You don't need God to have moral facts. There's no question. But that's not any kind of position I would want to challenge. But here is a problem, and it's not one that an atheist can solve, and it's the problem of the Plato's Republic. Do you recall what Plato's main worry was in the Republic?
That people will always just supersede themselves, or the strong will essentially win out.
Is the just life really worthwhile? The morally good life, is it truly worthwhile in that it can be sustained and will, shall we say, repay ultimate rewards? And in a purely secular universe, the answer is no. And Russell, in Free Man's Worship, was utterly honest about this and saying, in effect, look, we're going to the same dustbin as the rest of the physical universe. Tighten your belt and own it. And Russell was very proud of this in Free Man's Worship. I trust you've read that, the
Hmm.
1903 piece, and it's loaded with purple language, but it still should be read as
Purple language.
it's embarrassing. It's just embarrassing. Russell goes, he gets on a soapbox and starts preaching how this is the kind of thing that we must encourage our brethren in their moment of weakness and trouble, and we must stand for this courage in the face of our going down into the dustbin. Russell gets very passionate as if he's a preacher. Of course, he's cheating. The whole end of Free Man's Worship is just dishonest because he has no word of positive comment to offer to his brother going down into the dustbin of history. Russell, by his own standard, is going down with him and has nothing to shore him up. So Russell's just dissembling in that essay. But if you're an atheist and you want to be cheery, as was the case with Russell, an agnostic who wanted to be cheery anyway, he had to deceive. He had to put forth a kind of, well, you can tighten your belt and give this good message of positive news, stay the course, but you can't. Plato was right.
Well, I disagree with
The
that
universe is
actually.
a certain way. We can't have moral goodness sustained. It's going down into the dustbin with everything else.
Well, I would say that moral goodness is intrinsically good. I don't think you need it to be sustainable for all eternity. You don't think you need an afterlife. I don't
No.
think you need any of those things. I think that simply doing a moral action is in itself a good thing, regardless of whether or not it
Yes.
changes the world or lasts forever or whether or not we
Yeah.
have an afterlife or whether or not there's a God.
Don't confuse, though. I mean, you're exactly right. An episode of moral goodness can be discrete, finite, and good, period. No question. We don't need to tell a bigger story. Notice, though, that's not the question we're asking. That's not the question Plato asked in the Republic. Plato was asking whether the morally good life, that's not an episode of moral goodness, whether that can be offered as something, shall we say, sustainable, vindicatable, and commendable as having lasting value. So here's the key. When you're talking about the kind of value in life or meaning in life that many monotheists want to endorse, they are talking about lasting value and lasting meaning, not the short term kind that everybody acknowledges or should acknowledge can exist. And when you put the question that way, a naturalist view is at a serious disadvantage because it can't sustain lasting moral agency or the lasting morally good life. It can't. It doesn't have the resources. And Russell should have been utterly clear on that and said, if you're going to the dustbin now, I really don't have anything encouraging to offer you, because he didn't.
But why is that? Why is that important to morality? Because the way I see it is that morality is important regardless of whether or not it's lasting in that way. The lasting part is irrelevant. It's like what I did with free will, where you're trying to reduce it. You're trying to be a reductionist about morality and say that there's this further thing. It's about the lasting aspect. But to me, lasting is just not relevant to morality. Morality is true regardless of whether or not it lasts.
Well, again, we use the term morality in different ways. If we mean episodic moral actions, of course, no one's going to disagree. There can be morally good and right actions at a finite time period. But that's not the complete story about morality. They're also morally good agents. Let me give you an example. Suppose you're a morally good agent and you enjoy the morally good life, and you're associating with people who are morally good and also enjoy the morally good life. I'm going to give you a choice now. All of the things are equal in the relevant cases. Now imagine this. In one scenario, you and your morally good colleagues can live lastingly. That we'll call the lasting option. Then in the second option, you and your moral colleagues associate and get along morally, but it's all going to come to a screeching halt in, say, 20 years, period. Do you choose the lasting option or the short-lived option? Remember, all other things are equal. Which do you choose from the standpoint of what we'll call an overall morally desirable life?
Well, I would pick the lasting option for sure, but
Good.
let me try to ask you the reverse question. Let's say you could live an immoral life and kill lots of people, essentially like an evil scientist to do scientific research, and then discover a way to get a lasting life from that evilness. Or you could live a morally life and it only be a short period of time and then you die off and have it end. In that case, I would probably choose the moral option, even though the lasting aspect would be probably more desirable in many cases. The lasting part seems to be less important than the temporary morality. The temporary morality seems to be intrinsic to the morality, and the lasting is just kind of like a human addition on there that we want because it makes us feel good, but it doesn't seem to be intrinsic to what morality or to anything about morality.
Well, I'd have to know more about your example, but in the case you agreed with me on, what's clearly drawing us toward that preference is not just the extended time, it's that the moral goodness is being extended over time. In other words, the moral goodness has a longer life. And you and I are agreeing, I think, that that's a good thing.
I
So
think
what I'm saying is, well, I think that's what we agreed on in that case, that, excuse me, if you and your colleagues are morally good and you're flourishing in moral goodness and you have this choice, 20 years and it's all gone, or this can continue lastingly, I don't think our preference for the lasting option is just there's more time. I think it's rather that the moral goodness endures or perdures over time. And that gives us what we'll call a morally preferable option. I think you and I agreed on that.
well, I think the fact that it's more moral makes it a morally preferable option. But if we contrast it and say you could be immoral and live forever, or
Well,
be moral,
clearly it's not. You and I agree on this. It's not just the lastingness. I've never said it's just the lastingness. I said it's the moral goodness extending. That's the key. Now, what am I doing with this? I don't want to lose the track here. I'm saying that if we agree on that, then we're going to agree that the existence of a being who can sustain that kind of lasting moral goodness would be preferable to any situation where that being was absent, all other things being equal. In other words, God would serve a real role, a valuable role in sustaining moral goodness over time, in contrast with the short-lived option. If that's true, then the existence of God is morally significant to answer what I think was Plato's concern, at least one of his concerns in the Republic.
well, I mean, if that's your criterion for solving Plato's problem, I can do the same and say there is a natural heaven that has no God in it at all, and it just gives us that moral goodness that we have forever, and we need no God in that to have that. There's no God required. You can have the heaven without a God. There's no logical contradiction there. So you can have the moral goodness forever for everyone, and have that solution to Plato's problem without a God. You just have to essentially assert it.
Yeah, I don't know what you mean by heaven, and some people read Confucianism in this way, that it has a abstract heaven with moral principles. And like, by the way, it turns out that wasn't the view of Confucius. If you read the Analects, Confucius was a theist. Later, Confucianism, some of it moved away from theism, but Confucius himself was a kind of theist, and he held that God was a kind of um, personal agent who responded to prayer, and he acknowledged prayer. And this is in the Analects, and I read that as part of Confucius himself and not a later accretion. I think the later movement was away from it. But I'm making the point about God instead of an empty heaven in this regard. Genuine moral development that goes deep into a person, into conscience, into one's deepest moral commitments, is not just a matter of moral laws or principles, but is a matter of interpersonal guidance. I think what happens in genuine moral development is there's interpersonal guidance, and not just between humans, but I think through moral conscience with the influence of God in the case of a receptive person. Now, here's my challenge. Uh, Once you see the story of divine evidence as bearing on moral life in this way, then the challenge for us becomes, can we be candid enough about our moral experience to leave room for such evidence, not to suppress it, not to disregard it, but to give it honest attention? And that means I'm going to need to have some moral discipline here. I'm going to need to be morally attentive. I'm going to need to be morally responsive. I can't take a casual view of this anymore. It's going to be the kind of thing that is either going to define who I am or leave me suppressing it or shoving it to the side. In other words, this is too painful. As Martha Stewart said, just let me get back to my salad after she was challenged on her insider trading. In other words, I don't want to talk about this. Let me worry about my salad. Let me worry about my first cause argument. Let me worry about my nice argument from design here. In other words, I can do that stuff and be amoral. I can be morally indifferent. I can promote myself as smarter than thou, and I can beat you over the head with my fancy pants arguments and say, hey, shouldn't you bow and scrape at this point? But in the moral domain, it doesn't work that way. I'm challenged constantly to be responsive to these moral intrusions that bother me in my conscience. Is usually around 3 a.m. when I don't want to be bothered. Usually at times when I'd rather be sleeping or something. So this changes the whole context of discussion and raises the question about me. Am I willing to undergo this kind of change of priorities, this kind of redirection of who I am, including in relation to other people, especially in relation to my moral conscience, which should be the kind of thing that one is utterly careful about. Because if that is the place where the rubber hits the road, where divine challenge actually comes, then it is indeed a sacred place. The sacred place isn't in the heavy mortgaged megachurch down the street. The sacred place becomes in your conscience, where you could come face to face with God. And the question then is, what's my move? How am I going to treat this? And there's so many intellectual confusions that are really a thicket around the topic. And I think various versions of materialism and atheism are part of the thicket, but then so are certain versions of Christianity and other theism, because they distort the character of God and the corresponding evidence for God's reality. And if you distort that, you're at a big disadvantage. And we see that now in white evangelicalism in the US, and hence the ascendance of Trump and his evils. So this stuff matters. It bears directly on how people will be treated. It bears on the lives of many vulnerable people, especially refugees and immigrants. And so this is not just armchair stuff. Epistemology becomes immediately practical and morally challenging.
I totally agree on all of the moral stuff, but what you said earlier was that you believe that moral progress is not just based on interactions between the two people involved in the interaction, but it's also based off of a relationship you have with God in some way, and that He also helps guide you. And I think that's where the major disagreement is because I think
Yes.
that morality is more about the growth of your interaction with other people. I think that's how you morally grow. I don't think it requires that third party to be involved to have the moral growth.
Not de dicto, but de re it may. Again, we need to be careful. Whenever we talk about relation or we need to qualify, do we mean de dicto or de re? And clearly, it doesn't require de dicto. There are many fine atheists who are morally sensitive and relating to each other's in morally good ways, even better than how the white evangelical Christians in the U.S. do.
But is there any reason to think it's de re? Because I don't think there is that way
Yeah,
either.
that this is where we have to look at what I call the phenomenology of moral conscience. And phenomenology is just a fancy word for the nature of experience there. Is there an experience there of a person's being led away from selfishness toward a kind of genuine care for others, a kind of altruism?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
if there is coming out of conscience, and if it is directed and not just haphazard or coincidental, then you and I need to ask, why is it like this? Is there something deeper going on than just, this is what my parents told me, and I'm just playing it out? Well, for many of us, our parents didn't tell us to love our enemies. They didn't teach us to do something to free the brown kids in the cages at the Mexican border. This is something that came later, and that our teachers and parents don't deserve the credit. As I said, Freud was wrong there. Something deeper is going on, and you and I need to attend to the phenomenology of our moral conscience. What's really going on? What are we doing there? Are we being challenged by an agent seeking to direct us? We need to face those questions. Those questions aren't even on the table for most people.
All right, correct. That's the really interesting question. And my contention is that I agree we have those moral consciences, and I agree they are guided, but I don't think they need to be guided by a being. I don't think they need to be guided by a personal agent out there causing us to have those feelings. I think they can be guided by just more like even like a Platonic law or something like Plato's version. There are many ways to get those kinds of guided reactions in us for moral towards a moral goal without a conscious being.
Yeah, but notice that's a false dilemma. You can't just say, "Oh well, they don't need to be guided by an agent, therefore they are guided by." I didn't say they need to be guided by an. I said they are in some cases. There's a world of difference. I'm not giving you a kind of deductive argument from conscience for God's existence. I'm claiming something much more straightforward, that in conscience, one can be directly presented with the will of God, acquaintance, encounter. That's not an argument that infers one must acknowledge God here. That's the old fashioned natural theology. That's what someone like Anselm might say. I'm not giving you an ontological argument based on morality. I'm claiming, if you look at the phenomenology, conscience is the place where you can have an experiential encounter of God. And if somebody says, well, why do you think it's God? Then I say abductive inference helps. In other words, for many people, inference to the best available explanation helps because their experience is best explained among their available explainers by the claim that God has intervened in their world. And that experience is what you find from Abraham through Jesus to the Apostle Paul. They weren't giving arguments for God's existence. They were saying, God has shown up in my experience and challenged me to get away from my self-centeredness toward a kind of altruistic life. That's called firsthand encounter, not an argument that this must be a divine being. So it's a category mistake to turn this into any kind of ontological argument. Those are too easy to sweep away. It's not so easy to sweep away an abductive argument for a person who has had a firsthand experience of a personal will challenging that person. It's a different category.
Oh yeah, I totally agree there because my argument isn't about the ontological or deductive sense. Mine is that from my personal experience, since I never got that personal relationship, a personal experience with God. Abductively, the best explanation for me isn't a personal being. It's more an abstract kind of a law or something like that. So,
Th- That's a live option for some people. Look, agnosticism is logically coherent. Atheism is logically coherent. You'll never be able to justify atheism in an adequate way because you haven't covered anywhere near all the relevant evidence. For example, you haven't covered my evidence. You haven't covered my experiential evidence. So your atheism, if somebody's an atheist, won't challenge me at all if it doesn't bear on my experience. And I've never seen an atheist give a challenge to my experience in moral conscience. I haven't even seen an atheist make a serious effort at challenging that. Usually they just give you sweeping claims and then draw a general conclusion. And you say, wait a minute, that's cheating. That's not looking at all the relevant evidence. So, and I want to say the same about agnosticism. Of course, an individual can be a coherent agnostic and even an agnostic who's following his or her best evidence. Remember, I don't claim that all people have the same evidence of God's existence. Remember what I said about God hiding until some people are ready to receive the evidence? That's a critical story in the account of evidence for God's existence. That is, God wouldn't give cookie cutter evidence where everybody's supposed to have the same kind of evidence and everybody's supposed to infer that God exists. On the contrary, the tradition here is honest that the evidence isn't like that. So it's no threat to monotheism to say, here's a reasonable agnostic. That's not a threat at all because that person doesn't have the evidence. But then that person shouldn't infer that the monotheist doesn't have the evidence either. That would be called a bad inference. That's the interesting thing about evidence. It's experience relative, and we must pay careful attention to the variability of religious experience. That's hard for philosophers to do, but it's mandatory unless we're going to cheat.
oh yeah, I totally agree. Like, I believe that when I was a Christian and when I was praying every day, if I did have that personal experience of a God interacting in my life, then I would still be a Christian. So I can totally, I don't usually challenge personal experience because it is such a powerful form of evidence and it would have definitely changed my position in my life. So I totally agree with you on that point. And I totally agree with you that all the philosophical arguments are all junk and they don't do anything too. That's so yeah, this was we should probably wrap up. It's been about an hour and a half. So this was a really great conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Tom.
Awesome. Talk to you later. Bye.
Take care.